car outside Philadelphia brings heartbreak to a family and terror to a community. A young woman is dead, the killer gone. But the marks of his passage remain. South of Chicago, another mystery. A missing boy. A frantic search. Heartbreaking clues. Investigators struggle to find the boy and whoever took him. When victims are young, crime hurts that much more. And when the criminals are repeat offenders, it's a cruel turn of fate. Authorities are dedicated to solving these crimes and terminating the careers of those who are out to kill. At about 2 a.m. on June 20th, 1996, an off-duty ambulance crewman spotted a car abandoned on the road. It was parked on an exit ramp off Interstate 476, heading west away from Philadelphia. The car was running, and the headlights and radio were on. But no one was inside. The driver radioed 911. The emergency operator took the report, then dispatched 2 nearby troopers to the scene.
We will send a trooper out to the scene as soon as possible.
State Police Lieutenant Lenny Bandy was notified and headed to the highway interchange.
When the car was discovered, it was found with its driver's door open, the headlights were on, the radio was playing, and the engine was running. That was unusual to me.
It looked like a crime. The State Police Forensic Services Unit, headed by Corporal Alan Stewart, arrived at the scene.
Well, there was blood in front of the vehicle, and at that point I knew it was urgent to get everything started as quickly as possible.
At the front of the car was a tire iron. Near it, a small pool that appeared to be blood.
It was more than just an abandoned vehicle to me at that point. And it was a missing person investigation. It certainly was under suspicious circumstances with the presence of the tire iron and blood in front of the car and the hasty manner in which it appeared the occupant had left.
We'd collected the blood with the Q-tip, packaged it. We sent that out to the lab for DNA purposes.
Careful not to upset any potential evidence, they searched the car's interior and found a backpack. It appeared to be a college student's, but there was no identification inside. The car was registered to a woman in Brookhaven, Pennsylvania. Investigators learned the car was driven by her 22-year-old daughter, Amy.
1974.
While troopers spoke with Amy's parents, the crime scene processing continued.
One of the troopers had seen a pair of panties and shoes laying on a hillside. We went back to retrieve the pair of panties and shoes at that location.
Amy's mother later identified the shoes as her daughter's. It was looking more and more like a forcible abduction. Next to the clothing, troopers spotted a distinct tire impression, which was photographed.
Upon completion of the photographs, then we used dental stone to cast the tire impression.
The impression was sent to the crime lab. Amy's parents were worried. They knew the effects of crime firsthand.
Her father was a police officer. Her mother was an emergency room nurse. We wanted to do everything in our power to bring this young girl home safely to her family.
Here for a visit.
They had been out of town and hadn't seen their daughter in several
Very
days,
likely wearing this necklace at her
but knew that Amy had planned to go out with friends that night. Her parents gave a description of their 22-year-old daughter, including the tattoo on her ankle.
If you don't mind, I'd like to keep this picture so I can distribute it.
Do you want others?
As the APB went out for the missing college student, the Philadelphia area press jumped on the story.
She'll be right out for you, sir.
By morning, the media coverage brought forward Amy's friends, who had been with her the night before.
We were trying to retrace Amy's whereabouts, reconstruct her activities from the time that she was last heard from to the time that her car was found.
All of Amy's friends had the same story. It was an impromptu reunion of high school friends. They talked for a few hours, catching up. Friends said when Amy left the bar around 1:30 a.m., she was alone.
What's going on with her?
No one had seen or heard from her since.
Also had a denim jacket as well.
Tell me what happened.
At Delaware County's Criminal Investigation Division, Detective Sergeant Greg Seltzer and Detective Charles List were shocked to hear their friend's daughter was missing.
I've known Paul for a number of years. I know Amy's mother, so we wanted to do anything we could to help with the investigation.
Detective Sergeant Seltzer contacted their superior, who immediately put them on the case.
I went to the captain, who was the chief of county detectives, and explained to him that we have a police officer's daughter that's been missing.
While search teams looked for Amy, a task force gathered at the state police barracks to plan the intense investigation.
We utilized what's known as victimology. We wanted to learn about Amy and her behaviors and the patterns of her conduct. We learned that she was a regular kid.
Amy Willard was a star athlete at George Mason University, a responsible student taking summer classes. No ties to anything or anyone dangerous. By 5 p.m., 15 hours had passed with no sign of the missing girl.
While we were in the meeting, they received a call from Philadelphia police that they had a body and it matched the description of Amy.
Children had discovered the nude body that afternoon in an isolated area of North Philadelphia. It was 25 miles from Amy's car. There was no purse or clothing on or near the body, but everyone knew who it was.
That's Amy.
The physical characteristics, the size, the height and weight, it was consistent with the description given to us by Amy's family, and most specifically the presence of a tattoo on her right ankle, which was consistent with the tattoo that Amy had.
Finding Amy this way was difficult for everyone involved. Before the autopsy, her parents confirmed their daughter's identity. The medical examiner determined the young woman had died of multiple blunt force trauma to the head and body. It was a vicious attack.
When we were at the autopsy, we noticed there was a pattern on her right side, and it was in the shape of squares with the X's in the middle of the squares that were actually burned into her right side.
The burn pattern was so distinctive, investigators believed if they could find its source, they could find the killer. The medical examiner also recovered semen and believed the victim was sexually assaulted. The fluid and samples of Amy's blood were sent to the lab for testing. At the Pennsylvania State Police Regional Crime Lab in Lima, experts determined the blood found near the car was Amy Willard's. The seminal fluid recovered from the victim was also analyzed. Using a technique known as PCR, examiners made millions of copies of an isolated DNA strand until it was large enough to decipher. Once they could read it, they put together a genetic profile of the possible assailant. But they got no hits on any DNA database. Still, it was crucial evidence, according to Delaware County Assistant District Attorney Dan McDevitt.
We had the genetic profile of the killer. We just didn't have a name to go along with that profile.
They also believed they had his tire print. Lieutenant Dennis Luce, commander of training and technical support at the crime lab, examined the tire cast.
The cast that we were looking at was a tire that had 4 grooves and 5 raised areas. So when we did our search of the database, we were only looking at tires that had the same number of grooves. We determined from the database that it was a Firestone FR440 tire.
Although it was a common tire, it might help confirm or eliminate a suspect. Investigators also needed to examine the burn pattern from the victim's body.
We believed if we could find the source of that pattern injury, we could find out who the killer was.
From the burn pattern, a pathologist tried to determine the shape and dimensions of the object that made it.
Although he couldn't tell us what the object was, he drew a picture of what the object looked like.
The investigative team had a great deal of evidence: the burn pattern, the tire track, and the genetic profile of the killer. But they had no idea who he was. Knowing why Amy stopped her car might help identify the killer.
I have no idea.
Both Mom and Dad assured us the only reason she would stop if a police officer had pulled her over.
A police impersonator, a frightening possibility, but a real one. As the first few crucial days of the investigation passed with no solid leads, the law enforcement community grew frustrated.
It was a virtual whodunit. It was a needle in a haystack.
A vicious killer had stolen the life of this well-loved young woman, the daughter of a cop and a nurse, one of their own. And the investigators of Delaware County would never give up until they found him. In Delaware County, Pennsylvania, state police and county detectives were investigating the brutal homicide of 22-year-old college student Amy Willard. Many knew Amy, the daughter of a local police officer and a nurse. Investigators had good physical evidence, including a distinctive burn pattern on the body and the DNA profile of the suspected killer, but no suspects. One theory is that Amy stopped that night because someone impersonating a cop made her pull over. Detective Charles List sought information on known police impersonators.
I was surprised at how many police impersonators there were out there. We had a lot of interviews to do.
Many of those interviewed had solid alibis. But not everyone did.
No, I do not own a black Honda.
One suspect had a record of trying to pull over women.
You weren't on Route 1 at the entrance of Route 1?
Investigators could not corroborate his alibi for the night Amy was killed. And he worked near the place where the body was found. Detectives got a search warrant that allowed them to take a sample of the suspect's blood to compare his DNA against the DNA collected from the victim. State Police Lieutenant Lenny Bandy knew the genetic material was their greatest ally.
That was the most conclusive piece of evidence that we can use to include or exclude someone in our investigation.
The sample was sent to the lab for processing.
Yes.
The suspect in question also drove a car that could support the type of tire that left the impression near Amy's clothing. Examiners compared the tire cast from the scene to an inked impression of the suspect's tires. but reported no match. DNA experts eventually reported similar results. No match. The suspect was cleared.
There were numerous calls, tips that were made by the public. We were overwhelmed early on.
Despite checking every lead, they came up with nothing. Months passed. Frustration grew. Detective Charles List and Detective Sergeant Greg Seltzer eliminated every known police impersonator. They had no idea why Amy pulled off the road. Then, late on the night of May 29, 1997, almost a year after Amy Willard's death, 19-year-old nursing student Patty Jordan had just left a nightclub in Philadelphia and was driving home.
I noticed that a car was coming behind me with their headlights speeding up behind me. So I just kept my eye on him, and I switched lanes, and then he switched lanes with me, and then I did it again, and so did he, and I sped up, and so did he. I slowed down, and so did he.
The daughter of a Philadelphia police officer, Patty knew she needed to find her father.
I thought to myself, I was going to the 2nd Police District. That's the police district by my house. And then I would just pull in there and call my dad.
Off the interstate, she stopped at a red light.
And that's when he just slowly came up from behind me. I could see him, I could see his headlights, and I thought to myself, this guy's gonna hit my car. And that's when he hit my car. And then that's when I was like, oh my God, what is this guy doing? He kept motioning for me to pull over and pull over, just to pull over. I was mad and I was scared.
But Patty Jordan was not going to pull over.
And I just thought, I'm getting this guy's plate number. I'm gonna tell my dad.
Eventually, the man turned and drove away, but not before Patty got the plate.
I said it over and over in my head, and as soon as I came home and saw my brother, I ran to the kitchen and wrote it down.
Sergeant John Jordan is Patty's father.
The murder of Amy Willard had been in the news, so I entered the tag into the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, and it came back to an Arthur Bomar. And I noticed that the registration was to a Ford Escort.
But Patty said the man was driving a Honda. Sergeant Jordan also found out that Arthur Bomar was a convicted murderer who was wanted for a parole violation in Nevada.
And the more I thought about that and what had happened to my daughter, I just had to call Delaware County. Detective Sergeant Seltzer and his partner, Detective Charlie List, spoke to my daughter. And I could see the look on their face. I'll never forget the look on both their faces as they listened to Patty recount what happened to her.
Patty's description of the driver who bumped her matched that of Arthur Bomar.
Can you tell us what happened?
Although the plate was registered to a Ford Escort, Patty said she was sure it was a dark-colored Honda behind her.
I-95, and that's when I noticed that
The plate might have been switched. It was their best lead by far.
It was the entire case. It was the entire case. There was nothing, I can't describe how important that was. Just for her to grab that tag number and tell us. We wanted very much to speak with Mr. Bomar.
At first, they could not find the parolee. But after such a long and frustrating investigation, the investigators were surprised at how quickly the case took off.
We were a year into the investigation and following up every lead we could. Arthur Bomar comes into the picture within 3 days. Arthur Bomar is in custody.
Detective Sergeant Seltzer and Detective List went to interview Bomar at the Lower Marion Police Station, where he was being held on burglary charges. Bomar denied knowing anything about Amy Willard and said he had never been to the part of North Philadelphia where her body was found.
And you're still saying that you were...
He admitted he'd been to the bar Amy went to the night of her murder, but claimed he was not there that night. He was at a birthday party.
All right, Mr. Bomar.
After speaking with family members, we found that it was a lie, that he wasn't at the birthday party.
Securing a search warrant, investigators took samples of Bomar's cheek cells and hair to compare his DNA to the DNA recovered from the victim. The analysis at the busy State Police Crime Lab would take a few days. But because Bomar was in jail on another charge, Assistant District Attorney Dan McDevitt knew they had time.
Okay, Charlie.
A Montgomery County judge denied Bomar bail.
So there was no chance of him being back out on the street before we concluded our investigation. We had a lot of forensic evidence, and we wanted to carefully put all that evidence together because we only get one shot at him in court, and we wanted to make it a good one.
Police searched the area near where Bomar was arrested for burglary. Officers found a car with the same plate numbers Patty Jordan had given to her father. The plate was registered to a Ford Escort, but it was on a black Honda, just as Patty described. Technicians later found no evidence in the Honda related to the Amy Willard case. They needed to find that Escort. The case was heating up, but mysteries remained. The missing car, the peculiar burn pattern, and whether or not DNA would clear this suspect. After a year-long search, the investigators of Delaware County hoped they could solve these mysteries and find some degree of justice for a murdered young woman. Near Philadelphia, 22-year-old Amy Willard was abducted, sexually assaulted, and killed, left with a distinct burn pattern on the side of her body. A year later, Pennsylvania investigators had a suspect in custody. Arthur Bomar said he had nothing to do with Amy's death and claimed he wasn't at the bar where Amy was last seen alive. But detectives tracked down Bomar's girlfriend, and she had a different story. She was in hiding and fearful of Bomar. She said Bomar told her he was going to the bar in question on the night of the murder.
He started talking about.
Bomar confessed to his girlfriend that he watched Amy Willard leave the bar and followed her. He forced her to pull over, though the girlfriend didn't know how. Bomar said he then knocked Amy unconscious. He took her to North Philadelphia, where he raped and killed her. The girlfriend said Bomar was driving his Ford Escort that night. The statement of the girlfriend was a major break, but investigators needed evidence to back it up in court. Delaware County Detective Charles List and Detective Sergeant Greg Seltzer believed the key was Bomar's Ford Escort.
His vehicle is very important because at some point Amy was in that car.
Absolutely.
We went to an insurance company and found they had been in an accident shortly after Amy's abduction.
The detectives learned the car was towed to a salvage lot.
We obtained a search warrant. We were hoping to find some type of blood, hair, fiber that would link Amy Willard to Arthur Bomar.
When the tow truck lifted the car, investigators were stunned. The oil pan had a familiar pattern. They believed it was the object that burned Amy's body. At the State Police garage, the Forensic Services Unit processed the car.
What's that?
On the passenger side door panel, they found what appeared to be dried blood.
I'll take it down to the lab.
They removed the oil pan so it could be compared to photos of the burn pattern on the victim's body.
Yeah, that's it.
The technicians also collected the car's tires to check them against the tire impression from the scene of the abduction. Corporal Alan Stewart was part of the Forensic Services Unit.
We sent the oil pan to a pattern expert from the Armed Services, who then in fact did match the oil pan to the pattern that was on Amy's body.
Lieutenant Dennis Luce compared the tire cast from the crime scene to the print of a Firestone FR 440 tire from Bomar's car.
We were able to determine by comparing the track to the suspect tire that both had the same amount of wear.
I finished looking at that tire track that you sent in, that tire you sent in. It's consistent with the track from the crime scene.
Serology expert Cecilia Cassiola examined the door panel and found Amy Willard's blood.
Finding the victim's blood in the suspect's car puts the victim in the suspect's car.
But the most important forensic evidence came with the DNA results. It was a match. Assistant District Attorney Dan McDevitt.
The DNA evidence was irrefutable here. There was a 5 billion to 1 chance that Arthur Bomar was not the person who contributed the DNA found during the autopsy. So that obviously was the foundation of our case. In addition, we were able to link the car he drove to the thermal injury on Amy's body. Amy's blood was found behind the door panel in his car. The tires on Arthur Bomar's car left tire track impressions at the abduction scene.
It was enough to convince the jury. On October 1st, 1998, Arthur Bomar was convicted of first-degree murder, rape, and kidnapping. He was sentenced to death. Amy's family has fought for the laws to be changed to keep offenders behind bars, but the law did not pass in time to protect an Illinois family. Aroma Park is an hour south of Chicago. On an afternoon in 1995, Micah Moulton got nervous when her 10-year-old son Christopher did not come home from fishing at 5 o'clock as expected. It was not long before she had a feeling something was terribly wrong.
I jumped up and I looked at the clock. It said 5:22, and I knew immediately I needed to go find him. I had to go find him at that moment.
Leaving her other kids at the house in case Christopher returned, she went down to the Aroma Park boat ramp on the Kankakee River, where Christopher normally fished.
I walked around the area, I called his name, started yelling out for him.
After more than an hour of searching, Micah called the Kankakee County Sheriff's Department. Under Sheriff Brad O'Keefe worried when he heard where the boy was last seen.
The speed of that river, we have a lot of drownings. A lot of people fall in and disappear in that river, so that makes it dangerous in itself.
Rich, not a Aroma Park Boat Club right away. You got a missing 10-year-old.
Micah told Deputy Rich Burns about Christopher. She had already checked with all of his friends. No one had seen him since 4:30 at the boat launch.
It was very unusual for him to do this, for him not to return home on time, and we knew it was very important to get the ball rolling, to get the search started.
He's 10 years old.
And I said, well, I'm going to go in the woods and look for him. He said, just wait. He said, hold on. And he made a couple of radio calls, and the next thing I knew, there were search dogs and search teams and the fire department out there.
We didn't know if he had fallen into the river or if he had walked off, if he was just lost.
Right away, they threw every resource into the search.
All the local police agencies sent people. So we had fire departments from Aroma Park and Kankakee. They had the boats in the water doing the search. Once they knew what we were looking for, a lot of the citizens came up and volunteered.
They briefed the search parties, describing Christopher, his clothing, his bicycle. The searchers were instructed not to touch anything they found.
We don't know what happened at this point, so we're searching.
Any evidence should be collected by trained evidence technicians.
Anything you find, call Detective Bertrand. We're going to process it and handle it as evidence. Detective Bertrand will come out and collect it. All right? So everybody go
They had to
over here and line up
organize
along these woods.
and stay organized.
We have an assistant in the command center who keeps track of who's where and who's doing what searches.
Fire department personnel checked the water and riverbanks. Search dogs tried to track the young boy. Everyone prayed they would find Christopher quickly. Investigators interviewed anyone they could locate at the boat launch.
Sit over there. Did you see Christopher Meyer? Yes, miss. What did you guys see? Tell me everything you saw.
Two boys said they saw Chris with a man that afternoon, according to Kankakee County Administrative Chief Joe Mulcahy.
The man had a fishing tackle box with him, and in the box was some lures that were not appropriate for this area. It was saltwater lures, and the man did tell them that he was originally from this area, but had just came back from Florida.
The boys said there was a fillet knife in the box with the lures. They saw Christopher and the man leave the riverbank together. They could give only a vague description. A white male, tall, a mustache.
He had like all this neat stuff.
And we were concerned that there may be a possible abduction at that point.
No one slept.
We had detectives in here fielding calls all night. We had people searching the woods. We searched that woods 20 times, hoping that we would find something.
But that night, they didn't. Local news stations ran the story, broadcasting descriptions of Christopher and the unknown man he was seen with, and asking for more help. At the Sheriff's Emergency Operations Center, deputies and volunteers fielded calls. Many were tips suggesting they look into certain men as possible suspects. Investigators followed up on every tip, while the search continued, firemen dragging the river bottom. More than 18 hours had passed with no sign of Christopher. Then, the next morning, searchers spotted something in the water. A child's sneaker. Micah identified it as Christopher's.
We now have a shoe in the water. Chances are better now that he's in the water or something's there, so we've got to intensify the search there.
Dive teams searched for any sign of the boy or his bike.
It would overhear people talking about, any news, did they find a body? And a couple of times I lost it and said, there's not going to be a body, they're going to bring home Christopher. And I just kept a positive outlook on it, because I couldn't ever let myself think or feel that he wasn't going to come home.
Those searching for Christopher would not give up either. That little boy was out there somewhere, and they needed to bring him home. 10-year-old Christopher Meyer was last seen with an unknown man near the Kankakee River in Aroma Park, Illinois. Investigators did not know if Christopher had been abducted or if he fell in the river where they had recovered one of the boy's sneakers. Micah Moulton is Christopher's mother.
I felt everything was going to be okay, or eventually I was going to wake up, that this was just a really bad dream.
But it was no dream.
I got something here.
On the second day, one search team spotted something. Christopher's bicycle. It appeared someone had carried the bike deep into the woods and tried to conceal it, according to Undersheriff Brad O'Keefe.
It's that much more critical. We're not searching anymore for a lost child. We're not searching anymore for a drowned child.
Now they knew someone had taken Christopher. Several witnesses said they saw Christopher pushing his bike with a white male who had a goatee. They said at one point the man was standing by the open trunk of a gray four-door sedan that had fishing rods in the back window.
Just a short.
He had a fillet knife in a leather case in his back pocket. Some of the witnesses worked with a police artist to create a composite sketch of the man.
Right, yeah.
Investigators released the sketch to the media.
Once the picture was out, everybody had somebody in mind. So we're getting all kinds of tips and clues on who it might be.
Deputies followed up with every caller to the tip line.
We took a composite sketch and asked them to look at it and identify it.
Yeah, that's Bus.
One name came up more than any other, Timothy Buss.
When was the last time you saw him?
Fairly new to the community, Micah Moulton did not know the name.
No, we just need to ask him.
And I remember somebody coming in and saying, Timothy Buss, oh my God, I can't believe he's out. And they kept going on, and I said, who is like, Timothy Buss? Who is this Tim Buss? Who is this Timothy Buss? And nobody would tell me.
The investigators all knew Buss. In 1981, Timothy Buss had abducted and murdered a 5-year-old girl in nearby Bradley, Illinois. He was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years. But he had been recently paroled. Lieutenant Larry Osenga of the Kankakee City Police Department's Violent Crimes Task Force offered his squad's assistance. They asked around Buss's old neighborhood.
The neighbors advised us, yes, he was in the community.
Kankakee police learned Buss was now living in Joliet, Illinois, a western suburb of Chicago. Lieutenant Osenga called Joliet Police Department. Joliet agreed to check on Buss's apartment.
So Joliet assisted us. We went to where his residence was. He was not there at the time.
But the Joliet police sat and waited. The searches in the Aroma Park area kept on as another terrible night passed. Then, 2 days after Christopher disappeared, the Joliet surveillance unit spotted a man approaching Buss's apartment. It looked like the suspect. He was alone. Joliet contacted the Kankakee officers, who immediately drove up to the city.
You did Sparrow place? Yeah, about an hour now. Did you see him go anywhere? Sure he's in, right?
They checked the apartment,
When was the last time you saw him?
but no one answered. The place seemed deserted.
Hey, what's going on?
A neighbor noticed the police and told them she had seen Buss go out the back door.
He ran out of his apartment, jumped in his car with his headlights off, and he drove off at a high rate of speed and got away from us. We began a perimeter search trying to locate him, and we were not able to locate him.
A search of the apartment yielded no sign of the missing boy. APBs went out to law enforcement throughout the greater Chicago area with descriptions of Timothy Buss and his car.
Kankakee County Sheriff's Office, can I help you?
People began recognizing the sketch. A motel clerk in Braidwood, Illinois, called to say she thought Buss was staying there. Kankakee County sent Deputy Brady Bertrand to the motel in Braidwood, 25 miles south of Joliet.
At about 8 o'clock in the morning, Buss come out of the hotel and walked directly over to a dumpster in the parking lot of the hotel. He threw a pair of boots in the dumpster.
Deputy Bertrand radioed for assistance.
I'm just gonna stick with them. Need somebody to come back and put boots on the dumpster.
Then he followed the suspect.
He initially got on I-55 northbound, which leads into the city of Chicago, but he ended up getting off a short distance later and driving to Wilmington and pulling down by the river and talking to some fishermen down there.
Deputy Bertrand waited for backup to arrive.
Stand by till you get there.
While he did, Kankakee County detectives Ron Kilman and Randy Hartman responded to the Braidwood Motel to collect the evidence.
The boots were retrieved. We're not sure what
evidence that is going to be connected to, but he apparently put them there for a reason. So he secured them, whether there was possible blood located on them, hairs or fibers.
The boots were sent to the lab for analysis. The Kankakee officers hoped they could get Bus to talk.
Yeah.
He was very antsy and looking around as if he wanted to get away from there, but he had no place to go.
Every time something goes wrong, you guys are going to start coming to me. Yeah, we are.
At first, the parolee was evasive, not wanting to talk.
And we'll get it worked out.
But eventually, he agreed to come to the Kankakee County Sheriff's Department for an interview.
This ain't right.
At the station, Bus denied knowing anything about Christopher Meyer. His lawyer arrived to discuss investigators' request for a consent to search Bus's car.
I didn't have anything.
Against the lawyer's advice, Bus signed the consent form.
I have nothing to hide. Nothing at all.
At the Sheriff's Department garage, detectives Hartman and Kilman processed the suspect's car.
As a crime scene detective, we're basically putting a story together. And if you can do your job well enough, then you find that evidence that's able to tell you that story.
In the trunk, they discovered a car dent puller that appeared to have blood on it. There was also a tire iron and a tackle box like the one described by the boys who last saw Christopher. There was no fillet knife inside.
As we removed the items one at a time, then we were able to observe on the carpeting itself underneath the tools that there was a considerable amount of blood.
It was a difficult find, but an important one.
If in fact this was going to turn into a homicide, we needed to be able to put the boy and the suspect together.
Inside, the technicians also found a claw hammer.
It had dirt in the claw portion. What that told us was somebody's been doing some digging with this hammer.
On the passenger seat, the technicians recovered several head hairs. Like the other evidence, the hairs would be sent to forensics experts at the Illinois State Police Crime Lab. They had a suspect in custody and haunting evidence of foul play.
We still don't know where Chris is. We don't know if Chris is maybe hurt and bleeding. We were hoping we would find him stashed in a cabin or something along the river. So we never gave up hope that he would still be alive.
In 1995, Kankakee County, Illinois investigators were searching for 10-year-old Christopher Meyer, who was abducted while fishing. Evidence technicians found blood, hairs, and a dirt-encrusted hammer in the car of Timothy Bus, who had been seen with Christopher the day the boy disappeared.
They came in. Our investigations led us to believe that you have...
Authorities arrested Bus and charged him with aggravated kidnapping.
Every time a child misses you, you know this ain't right. You know this ain't right.
He refused to cooperate. At the Illinois State Police Forensics Lab, DNA research coordinator William Frank examined the evidence from Bus's trunk. He would compare the blood from those items to a DNA parentage profile created from Christopher's parents and to a probable sample of the boy's DNA called a convenience standard.
The convenience standard that was used was the child's asthma inhaler.
From the swabs of the inhaler and the parents' blood samples, Frank created a genetic profile using PCR testing.
The parentage comparison from the child's parents was consistent with the inhaler.
He then checked that profile against the blood from the car.
When I compared the profile that was identified in the asthma inhaler to the profile that was identified in the blood stains from the suspect's vehicle, the two profiles matched.
They still held out hope that the boy was alive. Kankakee County Sheriff Bernie Thompson.
After Timothy Bus was in custody, we were still looking for Christopher.
And there was always that hope that we would find him alive.
A few days later, a search party that included Sheriff's investigator Kenneth Ponton discovered a pair of boys' briefs and later a fishing pole and part of a T-shirt.
We called Investigator Mulcahy and gave her the description of the items and asked her to check with the missing boy's mother, which she did, and the mother was able to identify that these items belonged to her son.
3 days later, in a part of Kankakee State Park, Will County deputies made the discovery that would finally end the search. Under a piece of plywood, partially buried, was the body of a small boy. He had been stabbed more than 50 times with a thin knife. It was Christopher. Evidence technicians collected a clump of dirt containing a boot print from the gravesite. They also collected samples of the soil in the area. Hair and fiber expert Ralph Meyer compared the hairs found in Timothy Buss's car to Christopher's using a comparison microscope.
Looking at the general appearance, the length, the distribution of the pigmentation, the fusi throughout the shaft, ovoid bodies.
The hairs were microscopically consistent in every regard. Geologist Ken Knight examined the soil samples taken from the gravesite and the soil found on the claw hammer.
We tried to determine if the knowns and unknowns had the same characteristics, the same amount of crystals or mineral particles, the same colors, same angularity of those particles, the same general type of botanical material.
Again, a match.
The fact that the soil from the hammer is consistent with a mixture of the soil samples from the gravesite indicates that the hammer was used to actually dig the grave.
Some of that soil held a partial impression of a boot print. Forensic scientist Robert Hunton compared boots Buss threw out at the motel to that impression.
I made a cast of that particular portion of the boot that had a similar pattern to the piece of soil. I compared those side by side. I was able to say that that impression could have been made by that portion, that small area of the right boot.
Investigators hoped more definitive proof would come from the DNA lab. William Frank checked samples from the victim's femur against the evidence he already had.
The genetic profile for the femur bone matches the genetic marker profile identified for the child's inhaler and also matches the bloodstains identified in the trunk from the suspect's car.
The forensic evidence proved that Timothy Buss abducted Christopher Meyer. He assaulted the boy, stabbed him repeatedly, then buried him in the woods. Buss was found guilty of kidnapping and murder and was sentenced to death. That sentence was commuted to life in January 2003, but this time there will be no chance of parole. Christopher's mother, Micah Moulton.
The anger and the sadness and the grief and all was so overwhelming, but I knew I could use it in a positive way to make a difference. I want laws changed. I helped in lobbying for the No Second Chances for Murderers, Rapists, and Child Molesters law, also known as Amy's Law.
That law, named for murdered college student Amy Willard, seeks to prevent the most violent criminals from being released on parole. It was passed by the U.S. Congress in 2000. A friendly Midwest lodge becomes the scene of a gruesome double murder. 2 men are dead, and a safe filled with cash is missing. But the investigation runs cold until several crucial tips and equally solid lab work pry the case wide open. In Michigan, an elderly man is found brutally bludgeoned. dead in his own home. Detectives have more questions than answers
This is probably going to be the most likely choice.
as they follow a forensic trail of lies and deception, leading to an unlikely killer. Two completely separate crimes, two different killers with one common thread. Both possess a murderous rage stemming from raw greed. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Dayton, Ohio, the heart of the Midwest, where old-fashioned values are appreciated and crime still shocks the core of the community. St. Patrick's Day is usually a time of celebration, but in March of 1994, the party's aftermath took a deadly turn. Mary Pickett's husband, Frank, was unusually late. Early that morning, he'd gone back to the local lodge to clean up after the St. Patrick's Day party the night before. Mary hadn't heard from him all day, so she decided to drive to the lodge to see if he was okay. Frank's vehicle was still parked outside, and the side door of the lodge was wide open. She instinctively began to fear the worst and phoned the police. Dayton police officers responded to the scene.
My husband didn't come home last night, so I called over here and there was no answer.
Okay, I'll stay by the front door.
Nervously, Mary waited while the officer entered the lodge. He noticed something unsettling. The St. Patrick's Day decorations were still hanging, and it was eerily quiet. Then, on the floor of the kitchen, he discovered a lifeless body.
I'm gonna need for you to stay by the front door. Don't let anybody in.
Concerned the assailant may still be in the building, officers cautiously searched the area. The perpetrator was long gone, but before he fled, he left another calling card, a second victim. On the men's room floor, another man was dead. With not much to go on, police launched a full-scale murder investigation. Mary Pickett confirmed the identity of her husband and the other victim, maintenance worker Boyd Walker. She explained Frank and Boyd were on the cleanup committee and were getting the lodge ready for their weekly meeting. Dayton Police Detective Doyle Burke examined the bloody scene and began to piece together the events that led up to the murders.
The first thing that caught my eye was the doors were very formidably locked. However, they didn't appear to have been tampered, so I felt there was definitely no forced entry.
Detective Burke looked around for other clues and saw the cigarette machine had been pried open and nearly all the money was gone. He then found a bloody hammer on the floor of the back office.
It looks like some blood and hair on that hammer there. Do anything we want to take?
Crime scene technicians photographed the possible murder weapon. It was carefully collected and sent into the lab for analysis. Detective Burke's next move was to reconstruct the crime step by step.
The victim was in the restroom area, and he appeared to have been laid out there and then beaten to death rather than just caught by surprise. The other victim in the food preparation area was very different. He appeared to have been caught off guard before he was beaten. I kind of thought that perhaps he was the one that may have opened the door for the suspect.
Samples of the blood found in both rooms were preserved and sent to the lab along with the other evidence gathered at the scene. Detective Burke took note of the blood spatter on the walls and the floor, hoping the pattern would be a clue as to how these two men died. As coroners removed the victims' bodies from the lodge, Detective Burke had many questions about the killer. He believed the men not only knew their killer, they may have opened the door for him.
Okay, I think I'll expedite it.
The autopsies were performed at the Montgomery County Coroner's Office by Dr. Russell Updegrove.
Palpate a few skull fractures here also. We're going to need a photograph of this.
Preliminary findings indicated that Frank Pickett received 19 blows to the head. Boyd Walker had been struck 18 times. Both victims suffered cerebral contusions.
With a hard tile floor surface, and looking at the blood, it looks like he may have just been caught by surprise from behind.
Dr. Updegrove's findings also revealed the murder weapon left crescent-shaped marks on the back of their heads.
Upon further examination of the individuals at the injuries sustained on the heads of these individuals was consistent with the types of injuries that could be inflicted with a hammer.
Forensic scientist Denise Rankin processed the hammer at the Miami Valley Regional Crime Lab.
I examined the hammer for blood and for hair. I attempted to remove the hairs from the hammer, and there were red stains, which I tested to determine if they were blood, and I determined that they were blood, and they were a mixture of both victims' blood.
The analysis performed on the hammer came up empty. The investigation stalled. A task force meeting was called to determine the next move.
At this point, we've got nothing on it. You guys are the main crews downtown.
Detective Burke was joined by Detective Tom Lawson. Together, they headed up the task force.
We got nothing. What you guys got?
One officer learned a vagrant named Timothy Clifford had been trying to scam money from a local church on the day of the murder.
Timothy Clifford?
It was the first solid lead.
In following up on Timothy Clifford, who was an initial suspect in these offenses, the first thing we obviously did was took steps to locate him.
Detectives found Timothy Clifford at a local homeless shelter not far from the lodge. Clifford admitted he was begging at the church that day, but claimed he was in the shelter all morning.
I went to church to get some money.
He said the shelter had a book that kept track of the residents' whereabouts.
It was a lockdown facility, and during the time frame that these homicides occurred, his whereabouts were verified at that shelter.
The lead was a dead end. Detective Burke hoped the lodge manager could provide the investigation with a much-needed jump start. The manager told the detective the safe was missing. It contained all the proceeds from the party. He also said a two-wheeled dolly was missing from the back office. The manager explained to Detective Burke that Frank Pickett had an unusual habit of sealing the deposit bags with duct tape before depositing them at the bank. And since the detectives believed the men knew their killer, the lodge manager provided them with a list of employees and members, both past and present.
I had a strong belief that it was somebody familiar with the operation, and of course the first place I'm going to look is ex-employees and then current employees.
The next step was to track down anyone who might know why Frank Pickett and Boyd Walker ended up dead.
Hey, didn't you work over at Hopkins for a while?
After speaking to dozens of people, police came up empty-handed. The former workers and members all had solid alibis and had no motive for murder. But back at the station, calls and tips were pouring in. And this time, there were some promising leads. Police began to see a pattern. Most of the information revolved around one man, Edmund Emmerich. One caller said Emmerich bragged of being able to lift a safe single-handedly. And another caller said he once saw Emmerich pry open a cigarette machine at a bar. But the biggest break came when a phone tipster came into the police station.
No one tip in and of itself that was enough to say that Emmerich committed these crimes. But when the volume kept coming in with information about Emmerich and multiple tips and information about Emmerich, certainly he became an individual we were very interested in.
What you have to see right here.
The informant was a local man familiar with Edmund Emmerich. He knew Emmerich had worked for a bar in the neighborhood. He said Emmerich had a reputation for beating up patrons in his own bar. Then he would call the cops and say they passed out. He said he saw Emmerich in another local hangout, getting change from the bartender when his bar ran out. He stated that Edmund Emmerich could be intimidating, a local who clearly knew his way around the bar district. He also told police Emmerich bragged that he knew where the lodge kept their safe.
There was information about Emmerich losing his job and needing money, and then shortly after these offenses, having money. So each little piece of the pie basically in and of themselves were not enough, but when they culminated, it was clear he was of high interest to us.
Police needed to find out as much information as they could about Edmund Emmerich. It didn't take long to find out he had a police record. A record which included an outstanding traffic warrant and, more interestingly, an arrest for safecracking in the state of Ohio. Once his name came up in the investigation, detectives began to keep an eye on him. The outstanding traffic warrant gave them what they needed to take him off the streets.
Stop right there, sir. Take your hands out of your pockets for me. Stand still for a minute. Let me talk to you.
The warrant gave detectives the perfect opportunity to interrogate Emmerich for a far more insidious crime, the double murder.
In the course of the investigation, we pursued several leads, but again, everything kept coming back to Emmerich.
And for the first time in this particularly violent and frustrating case, it looked as if detectives Burke and Lawson finally had a solid lead and a potential murder suspect. Dayton, Ohio detectives were making headway in the gruesome double murder that took place at a local lodge the morning after St. Patrick's Day. They had a few clues, a stolen safe, a missing dolly, and a bloody hammer. But nothing added up. After hitting several dead ends, one name repeatedly turned up on the crime tip line: Edmund Emmerich. Emmerich worked at several bars in the vicinity of the lodge and had a reputation for being hot-headed and dangerous. He had an outstanding arrest warrant, and police picked him up. Detective Doyle Burke believed they were on the right track.
There was information that was received about Emmerich being very brutal and very physical.
After his arrest, Edmund Emmerich jumped to the top of the detective suspect list when they noticed bloodstains on his clothing.
I cut myself shaving. Looks like blood to me.
He claimed he had cut himself shaving, but the detectives remained skeptical. Something didn't add up. His alibi was a little too good.
What I want to do is, for someone to tell me minute by minute, hour by hour, exactly what they had done is suspicious.
Detectives Burke and Lawson asked Emmerich to surrender his clothes as evidence.
The blood that was found on Emmerich when he was first arrested was on his shirt and on his shoes and also on his jacket.
He spent the night in jail while his clothes were sent to the lab for blood analysis. The detectives hoped the blood on Emmerich's clothes would match the victim's blood. The evidence was tested at the Miami Valley Regional Crime Lab. Denise Rankin explains.
There was blood on the clothing that was consistent with the suspect's his own blood on his own clothes.
But like the hammer, the blood on the clothes did not bring the detectives any closer to catching the killer. In fact, the jacket appeared to support the suspect's story that he had cut himself shaving. But detectives Burke and Lawson weren't giving up on Edmund Emmerich. A warrant was issued to search his house. They discovered a deposit bag sealed with duct tape.
See what else we can come up with.
An informant had told detectives one of the murder victims sealed the bags for deposit in the same manner. Technicians photographed the evidence and took several other items of Emmerich's clothing for further forensic testing.
And you just step right down there to that gate for me.
With no immediate proof to hold Emmerich, the suspect was released. But Burke and Lawson believed they had their man. They just had to prove it. The day after his release, detectives had Emmerich's car impounded. Evidence technicians went over the automobile with a fine-tooth comb. Inside the car, they found an additional hammer and a lug wrench. Each was gathered and sent to the lab.
That sample and get a
Technicians took gray paint samples from smudges found inside Emmerich's car door. Investigators believed the paint might be from the lodge's missing safe. The paint smudges were analyzed at the Miami Valley Regional Crime Lab by Director Ken Betts.
We're looking to make the determination whether the paint, gray paint that's on the safe, was also left on the vehicle in question by the suspects.
Investigator Burke and Lawson's next move was to check on Emmerich's ever-so-careful alibi, starting with his family. Emmerich claimed to have spent the morning of March 19th visiting his father before heading to a local laundromat. The detectives were not surprised, nor convinced, when Emmerich's father confirmed his alibi. But a female employee at the laundromat was more helpful in punching holes in Emmerich's story. She said his behavior was suspicious on that day, that he parked unusually far away from the front door, especially since he had an incredible amount of clothes to be cleaned.
The amount of clothes that Emmerich had picked up that day was unusual, and I believe that was part of the prepared alibi, that he wanted to make it so memorable that the laundromat would remember this individual had so many clothes. It was such a big order.
But the most damning thing the laundromat worker remembered was that Emmerich left a two-wheel dolly in the parking lot of the laundromat, just like the one missing from the lodge.
And his alibi ultimately was part of his downfall, in that it leads us to being able to verify that a two-wheel dolly is taken from the scene of the crime, and Emmerich's in possession of a two-wheel dolly just moments after the crimes have occurred.
Then a phone call came into the Dayton Police Department. It was the break the detectives had been waiting for. A discarded safe found right in the area where Emmerich had based his whole alibi. A safe so heavy, even a strong man like Emmerich would need a dolly to transport it. Police examined the abandoned safe found outside a hardware store. The front door had been completely pried off. The local hardware store clerk said she had seen a white male matching Emmerich's description, wheeling the safe down the street on a two-wheel dolly. It was as if the dam had burst open on the case. And the safe and the dolly were just the beginning. Test results came back from the forensics lab. There was blood on one of Emmerich's shirts, and it matched the blood of one of the murder victims.
I'll tell you what made me
the blood on the shirt was from the scene, and we were able to tie him to that scene with that blood.
Evidence was mounting, and detectives were closing in on Edmund Emmerich. But it would take one more piece of damning forensic evidence and an eyewitness to bring this killer to justice. Local bartender Edmund Emmerich was the strongest suspect detectives Burke and Lawson had in their investigation of a brutal double murder and robbery at a local lodge in downtown Dayton, Ohio. Emmerich had a reputation for violence and a criminal conviction for safecracking. A combination of circumstantial and definitive evidence was mounting a case against the suspect. But it was a paint smudge found inside Emmerich's car that provided a crucial piece of physical evidence. At the State Crime Lab, Director Ken Betts compared the paint smudge found in the car to paint scraped from an abandoned safe.
We were able to determine that the paint found on the vehicle was consistent with the gray paint of the safe. And it became another investigative tool for Dayton Police detectives to go forward with.
After chasing down leads for weeks, Detectives Burke and Lawson were finalizing their case against Edmund Emmerich. But there was one more piece of evidence. An eyewitness came forward. His name was Brian Towns, a local homeless man who actually saw Emmerich enter the lodge on the morning of the killings.
In interviewing him, we were able to determine that he not only saw Emmerich down at the scene of the crime that day, he saw the door that he entered in. He also saw him exit, and also even spoke with Emmerich during the time frame that we were certain these homicides had occurred. Eddie went into Hopkins.
When Emmerich came out of the bar, Towns bummed $20 from him and watched him go on his way. Detective Burke showed Towns some photos, and the homeless man positively ID'd Emmerich.
You saw at Hoppy's that day?
Yeah.
That's Eddie. Off hours with only two people there, you're not going to let a stranger in. And we come to find out that Emmerich did know both individuals. Emmerich, of course, through Brian Towns, was identified as being at the scene.
Detectives now had a man placing Emmerich at the scene of the crime at the time of the murders. But they were taking no chances before arresting Emmerich again. Back at the crime lab, another piece of forensic evidence proved Edmund Emmerich was the killer. Toolmark examiner Tim Dewar cast impressions from the lug wrench found in Emmerich's car.
Identifying a tool mark to a specific tool is like identifying a latent fingerprint at a crime scene to a known fingerprint of a suspect.
The impressions from the lug wrench were then compared to molds of impressions found on both the cigarette machine and the safe from the lodge. They were a perfect match.
The castings from the cigarette machine were microscopically compared to the castings of the test tool marks from the tire iron. Upon comparison, several matches were found between the two, and with that, the conclusion can be drawn that the tire tool made the tool marks on the cigarette machine, to the exclusion of all other tools.
The tool impression match was the final piece of the evidence puzzle. Not only did police have an eyewitness placing Emmerich at the scene, they now had clear evidence. He had broken into the cigarette machine and safe. Police went in to make an arrest. Although Emmerich tried to run, the police completely surrounded the house. There was nowhere for Emmerich to hide. After weeks of tracking down the killer, detectives got their man. And they were now about to get the full story of what happened at the lodge that tragic morning. As suspected, Boyd Walker knew his killer and naively opened the door to his own murderer. He had no way of knowing that Emmerich had come into the bar intent on murder and robbery. When Walker turned his back, Emmerich grabbed a hammer and brutally killed him. Just as viciously as he had struck Boyd Walker, Emmerich killed Frank Pickett. In just a matter of minutes, both men were dead. Emmerich scrambled, grabbed the dolly, and wheeled the safe out of the lodge. He later abandoned the dolly in the laundromat parking lot.
Emmerich was in dire need of money, and this was an opportunity to take advantage of two individuals that would trust him.
Edmund Emmerich was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder for his fatal assault on the 2 bar workers, as well as a count of robbery. He was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. Some killers prey on unsuspecting targets of opportunity, making it easier for them to conceal their identity. Others strike closer to home, leaving behind traces of raw greed. Emmett Township is a rapidly growing community of 12,000 people located on the eastern border of Battle Creek, Michigan. They pride themselves on being a close-knit, safe haven. Which is why what happened on the morning of April 26, 1996, was such a shock to the small town. That morning, Sharon Zachary went to check on Bob Rogers. She had been taking care of the 81-year-old man and rented a house down the street from him. Sharon was worried. She hadn't heard from Bob all morning. When Sharon saw his car at the side of his house, she became particularly concerned. He never parked there, and he hadn't been answering his phone. Her concerns were instantly confirmed when she saw the sliding side door to the house had been completely smashed in. She ran for help. Sharon Zachary was panicked. Her friend Bob had been the victim of several robberies in recent months. It looked as if this was another one.
Attention all Emmett officers. Be advised, 7419 Jefferson Drive, our check welfare, possible assault.
Officers were familiar with Bob Rogers. It was not the first time they had been summoned to his residence. They knew the elderly man had a reputation for being a pack rat and for keeping large amounts of cash around the house. They entered the home carefully and cautiously so they would not disturb any potential evidence. But this time, the crime was worse. There, lying face up in his family room, was Bob Rogers. And he was dead.
Hello? Is Bob okay?
No, he's not, man. We have signal 15 here. We're going to need nav tech, also notify command, please.
Emmett police now had what appeared to be a homicide on their hands. Lieutenant Thomas Headley arrived, prepared to begin the investigation. His first move was to speak with Sharon Zachary, the woman who had discovered the body.
The house here, Mr. Rogers' house. The other officer arrived.
After asking her to go to the station to make a statement, he examined the bloody crime scene. From the start, Lieutenant Headley knew this crime did not happen like the others.
This crime scene is a little bit odd to me. It's not consistent with what we know of the behavior of Mr. Rogers. Also, the fact that the sliding glass door was broken in the rear of the house was not consistent with the other crime scenes. People did not have to go through that effort to gain insurance.
Among the strewn clothing and blood spatter, the crime tech team took measurements, photos, and samples, all potential evidence. Forensic technicians paid particularly close attention to the victim's twisted belt buckle.
Pick it up. We'll get one more.
Glass shards were photographed and collected for possible hand or footprints.
More money up here.
Not surprising to Lieutenant Headley was the large amounts of cash found stashed in various places around the room.
He was an elderly male, probably lived during the Depression, carried the money on him probably as a feeling of security.
Headley knew one thing. He was certain money was the motive. Now he had to find out who was responsible. At the Emmett police station, Lieutenant Anthony Geigel questioned Sharon Zachary. She told Lieutenant Geigel about her relationship with Bob Rogers.
You know, because every once in a while he'd...
She said she befriended the old man and rented one of his many properties. Zachary explained she was concerned about Mr. Rogers' safety, and she even insisted that he move in with her. She said she was tired of standing idly by while the old man repeatedly was the victim of violent robberies.
Went to the door.
Zachary told the lieutenant she saw no one the morning she found Bob Rogers' body. She went to his home when she hadn't heard from him. But to Geigel, there was something a little off about Sharon Zachary's story, and something odd about the whole murder.
The crime scene didn't match what had normally occurred in the past. The scene just had an aura about it that just something didn't seem right. It almost appeared that somebody tried really hard to make this look like a robbery.
Bob Rogers' autopsy was performed at the Sparrow Hospital morgue. Dr. Joyce DeYoung fingerprinted the victim post-mortem. She needed to determine which prints found on the scene belonged to the victim and which belonged to the possible killer or killers. DeYoung noted severe blunt trauma to Rogers' head and body.
Mr. Rogers had between 25 and 30 blows to the head. Most of the injuries to the head were of the back and on the left side of the head, which certainly would suggest that the blows were being inflicted from somebody from behind.
Judging from the position of Rogers' body and its decomposition, Dr. DeYoung concluded that Rogers' body was most likely moved after his fatal beating. She called Lieutenant Geigel to report her conclusions.
There is a pool of blood near the body that appeared to be where the body was in a face-down position, and then the body is rolled, and the hands and the forearms are up in the air after rigor mortis had set.
With fingerprints from the victim, forensic scientists began piecing together Bob Rogers' murder. Using a technique specifically designed for lifting fingerprints from porous surfaces, they analyzed the victim's belt. Numerous prints were lifted from the belt. Most of them belonged to Rogers, but one did not.
In fact, if it was someone other than the victim's print on their pants, then obviously it was somebody that touched that area. It would not likely have remained on the surface of the belt while the victim was wearing it in a conventional manner.
Scientists also found some compelling evidence on one of the shards from the broken sliding glass door. It was a muddy tennis shoe imprint.
Simply by walking over glass, the design elements of the shoe are reproduced on that glass with incredible detail. Including the not only the design, but wear characteristics, size, the individual characteristics, unique features about a shoe that enable us to positively identify the shoe.
The evidence was compelling, but it seemed to be leading nowhere. Lieutenant Geigel had no suspects, and every day that passed was another day the killer was free. Emmett Township Police were investigating the death of Bob Rogers, an elderly man who had been the victim of repeated robberies. They had evidence, fingerprints, and a muddy shoe print. Lieutenant Headley readied the next plan of attack. He knew the strong evidence in the case would ultimately help him convict the right suspect. Emmett police organized a task force to brainstorm leads in the brutal murder. And they made a shocking discovery.
Apparently, Mr.
They learned Sharon Zachary had power of attorney over Bob Rogers' finances.
Yes, I did. I contacted Tony.
Since she was the one who found his body and had unlimited access to his house, they needed to eliminate her as a suspect.
Still valid.
They obtained a search warrant and began to look into her affairs.
We started talking to family members, and as a result, we started looking at her a little closer as a possible suspect.
Their first stop was to return to the crime scene. Thousands of dollars were found in the house, cash stashed in every room. Investigators removed files and records from Rogers' home. In poring over his records, Lieutenants Geigel and Headley learned Sharon Zachary was using Rogers' credit cards.
Same thing here as some charge
Detectives
cards.
began to suspect their hunch about Sharon Zachary had been right.
We also pulled bank account statements, discovered that she had been actually withdrawing some funds from some of his bank account. So that kind of led us into motive a little bit, that there might be more to this and that there might be some money that may be at issue.
I handle all of his legal and financial matters. As a matter of fact, he was in here.
For further insight into Rogers' finances, they decided to question his lawyer.
Power of attorney to a Sharon Zachary.
Rogers' lawyer explained Zachary was granted power of attorney 4 months before the murder. But just 2 weeks before being found dead, the elderly man had abruptly changed his mind. He discovered $10,000 missing from one of his accounts, and he was furious.
The case further developed when we learned that Mr. Rogers had made a will leaving the property that belongs to him to Sharon Zachary upon his death.
Did you get the information?
With a motive clearly in place, Lieutenants Geigel and Headley sent an investigator to Rogers' bank. The bank manager said Sharon Zachary came in with Bob Rogers about a year before his death, asking to be put on his account. Rogers sat by uncomfortably while the paperwork was completed. But he returned alone the next day, requesting she be removed from the account.
He wanted her removed as the power of attorney. He wanted to handle his own affairs as he didn't trust Sharon Zachary any longer.
Mr. Rogers hadn't been able to get to his will yet. He was unfortunately murdered before he was able to do that.
Finally, detectives spoke to a security guard at a local discount store. Zachary went to buy some shoes and attempted to use Bob Rogers' credit card. When the card was declined, security was summoned to the counter. They called Rogers at his house, and he told them that under no circumstances did he give Zachary permission to use his credit card.
Young lady trying to use your credit.
She insisted there was a mix-up.
The significance of this card was that it caused Mr. Rogers to become suspicious because at that time he would have felt that he was being cheated by Sharon Zachary.
It was a huge break in the case. Detectives Geigel and Headley had confirmation that Sharon Zachary was desperately trying to take advantage of 81-year-old Bob Rogers. They were becoming more and more convinced that it was Zachary who killed the elderly man in a fit of greed. But they needed proof. If they could find a way to directly prove her guilt, the detectives knew they had found their murderer.
Take a look at what you got.
Lieutenant Geigel and Lieutenant Headley were hot on the trail of the murderer of 81-year-old Bob Rogers.
Hey, what do you got?
The man was bludgeoned to death in his own home, and preliminary evidence was pointing to the guilt of his caretaker, Sharon Zachary.
Yeah, it looks like she may have signed his name.
Zachary had been taking advantage of her power of attorney over Rogers' finances. It seemed clear the old man didn't appreciate Zachary spending his money.
start spending on ourselves.
We were trying to find anything that would link Zachary into any kind of financial wrongdoing, anything that we could find to help try to kind of piece everything together. Plus, we still had not found a murder weapon.
Then, another discovery. Lieutenant Headley learned Zachary had tried to get the plans to Rogers' land. They studied Bob Rogers' land plot. They wondered why Sharon Zachary, who rented one of Rogers' homes, would request a copy of Rogers' property plan. What they noticed immediately was the amount of water on Rogers' property. They knew one of the ponds would be the perfect place to stash a murder weapon.
There were 3 ponds that were adjacent to the house of Mr. Rogers, and we thought that possibly that they were used to hide the murder weapon. It is also interesting that there's a worn down trail that leads from this area of the 3rd pond behind Mr. Rogers' house to the house where Sharon Zachary lived.
Divers were dispatched to check the pond, and the detective's instinct paid off. The divers pulled a 3-foot section of pipe from the water. At the crime lab, forensic scientists examined the pipe. Although a long shot, there could still be blood evidence on the pipe. Forensic scientist Marjorie Harris.
You have pores and crevices and cracks that allow the blood actually to soak into the weapon itself, or dents. If you have cracks and crevices in a metal object, you still have pockets where the blood can accumulate and actually dry and adhere to those surfaces.
Despite the fact the pipe had been submerged in the pond, it still had remains of human blood.
I was very glad that we found it. I don't believe this has ever happened before, that a murder weapon like this could be retrieved, being submerged in water, and still have viable DNA that could be identified.
Forensic investigators replicated the blood spatter of the crime scene. Using a pipe similar to the one found in the pond, they struck a melon to simulate a skull. Comparing crime scene photos to the crime reconstruction, forensic investigators concluded the pipe pulled from the pond was the same pipe used to kill Bob Rogers.
We like to do a crime scene reconstruction where we can tell a series or a sequence of events. What happened, where did it happen, what was the order that it happened.
The detectives felt they finally had all the ammunition they needed to go after Sharon Zachary. With a search warrant in hand, they entered her house.
By seizing the financial records in Sharon Zachary's house, it shows that she had an interest in the finances of Mr. Rogers, and that she wanted to know apparently more about what kind of money that he had available to him.
Sharon Zachary was cooperative in allowing police to remove Bob Rogers' records from her house.
I have a pair of white shoes and stuff. Yeah.
The officers asked her for a pair of tennis shoes for comparison to a shoe print found at the crime scene. Without any argument, she produced a pair of white tennis shoes, which they promptly bagged for testing. Back at the crime lab, treads on Sharon Zachary's tennis shoes were compared with the footprints found on the broken glass at the murder scene. Although she insisted she never went in the house that morning, the preserved prints matched those of Sharon Zachary's perfectly.
The individual characteristics are exactly the same. Therefore, the impression from your crime scene and the impression made by the known shoe from the suspect are one and the same.
The shoe print was enough to arrest Sharon Zachary. It definitively placed her at the scene of the crime. The woman who claimed to be Bob Rogers' caregiver was now being arrested for his murder.
We believe that the forensic evidence that we located clearly established that she was at the crime scene. We established that Sharon Zachary was untruthful, and we believe that Sharon Zachary murdered Mr. Rogers.
Back at the crime lab, forensic scientists were comparing a fingerprint found on Bob Rogers' belt with Zachary's prints. It was a perfect match.
We actually physically found Zachary's print on the back of Mr. Rogers' belt, which shows that she had contact with the body. That didn't match with what she initially had told our officers.
Zachary said it was only natural they had evidence linking her to the crime scene. She said she spent so much time taking care of the old man that it was not surprising her print would be on his belt. But forensics told a different story about the print.
It is very fragile in nature and in all likelihood would have been destroyed in simply placing the belt through the belt loops and attaching it to the pants. If it has been on a person's clothing for a period of time, it's not likely that either the victim's print or a suspect print would be present on the underside of that belt.
It was too late for Sharon Zachary. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and everything was pointing to her guilt.
The forensic evidence we gathered at the scene of this incident were key into solving this crime. Everything from the thumbprint to the shoe impressions that were pulled to the murder weapon that we eventually found submerged in one of the ponds. That pulled everything together, made all the pieces fit, and allowed us to solve this homicide.
Sharon Zachary could no longer hide from what detectives were able to piece together. Angered by not being able to freely spend Rogers' money, Sharon Zachary let greed get the better of her.
Keep looking, keep looking.
On the morning of April 26th, she went over to his house. While he was stashing away some of his cash, she struck the elderly man repeatedly with a pipe.
I think she finally saw an opportunity to take him out of the picture, collect all of his estate, and walk away scot-free.
She rifled through Rogers' pockets, turning them inside out and removing the cash.
My guess is that she knew exactly what she was going to do when she went over there. She knew, based on his history of the robberies and the prior assaults on Mr. Rogers, that she was going to make it look exactly like that.
Attempting to make the premeditated killing look like a random robbery, she then went outside and smashed the sliding glass door.
Mr. Robert Rogers. Officer, would you take...
And after she did it, she tried to make the place look like your typical textbook breaking and entering. But she forgot a couple key facts. And I think that was her ultimate downfall.
Lieutenants Headley and Geigel's strong detective work held up in court. Sharon Zachary was found guilty of first-degree murder and armed robbery. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Some are victims of circumstance, killed for being at the wrong place at the absolute wrong time. Others are exactly where they belong, but remain unsafe from killers who seek them out with a motive of raw greed.